In the late summer of 1939, Europe held its breath. Trains moved across borders under strict military watch, diplomats whispered behind closed doors, and newspapers carried headlines that hinted at catastrophe without fully naming it. The continent, still haunted by the memory of the First World War, stood once again at the edge of destruction. What made the moment especially disturbing was not only the certainty of violence, but the quiet, calculated diplomacy unfolding in the background, diplomacy that would soon unite two sworn enemies in a pact that shocked the world. The roots of this crisis stretched back to 1919, when the First World War ended and the victorious powers gathered at Versailles to reshape Europe. Germany was blamed entirely for the conflict and punished severely. Large portions of its territory were taken away, its army was reduced to a shadow of its former self, and enormous reparations were imposed. For many Germans, the treaty was not a peace agreement but a national humiliation. Economic instability followed, and by the early 1920s, hyperinflation had wiped out savings and destroyed faith in democratic institutions. Though the Weimar Republic survived, it remained fragile, surrounded by anger, fear, and political extremism. At the same time, a very different revolution had reshaped the East. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had brought the Bolsheviks to power and given birth to the Soviet Union. Under communist rule, the USSR rejected capitalism and openly challenged the political and economic systems of Western Europe. This ideological divide ensured that the Soviet Union remained isolated throughout much of the interwar period. Western governments feared the spread of communism, while Soviet leaders believed capitalist states were determined to destroy their revolution. The global situation worsened dramatically after the Great Depression struck in 1929. Economic collapse spread across continents, destroying jobs, industries, and social stability. In Germany, desperation created opportunity. Adolf Hitler, a charismatic speaker with a talent for exploiting fear and resentment, promised national revival. By 1933, he had become chancellor, and soon after, dictator. Hitler rejected democracy, glorified war, and promoted an ideology rooted in racial supremacy and extreme nationalism. Communism, in his view, was not merely a rival system but an existential enemy. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to dismantle the post-World War I order. Germany withdrew from international agreements, rearmed its military, and openly defied the Treaty of Versailles. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland without resistance. 2 years later, Austria was annexed in an event known as the Anschluss. Each step was met with protests but no real action from Britain and France, whose leaders hoped that compromise would prevent another devastating war. This policy of appeasement reached its peak in 1938, when Germany was allowed to seize the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia under the Munich Agreement. For the Soviet Union, these events were deeply unsettling. Stalin watched as Western powers repeatedly gave in to Hitler, often without consulting Moscow. To him, it appeared that Britain and France were willing to sacrifice Eastern Europe in the hope that Germany and the Soviet Union would eventually destroy each other. Despite Soviet efforts to create a collective security system against fascist aggression, negotiations with the West moved slowly and produced little trust. Ideological suspicion ran deep, and neither side fully believed the other's intentions. By 1939, the tension had become unbearable. Hitler had turned his attention to Poland, a nation reborn after World War I and strategically located between Germany and the Soviet Union. Poland's existence stood in the way of Hitler's plans for expansion eastward. Yet attacking Poland carried enormous risks. Britain and France had pledged to defend Polish independence, and war in the West seemed likely. More dangerously for Hitler, an invasion could provoke a Soviet response, trapping Germany in a two-front war, a scenario that had contributed to its defeat in 1918. Stalin, meanwhile, faced his own dilemmas. The Soviet Union was vast but not invulnerable. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had eliminated much of the Red Army's experienced leadership, weakening its readiness for war. Industrialization was ongoing, but the country needed time to rebuild its military, strengthen its borders, and prepare for the conflict that Stalin believed was inevitable. Trusting Britain and France did not seem wise, yet leaving Germany unchecked was equally dangerous. As Europe drifted closer to war, both Berlin and Moscow began to reconsider the impossible. Despite years of propaganda, mutual hatred, and ideological warfare, practical concerns began to outweigh principles. Hitler wanted freedom of action in Poland without Soviet interference. Stalin wanted security, territory, and time. What followed was a diplomatic reversal so dramatic that it stunned the world. In the weeks before the outbreak of war, secret contacts intensified between German and Soviet officials. While Western diplomats still hoped for last-minute agreements, negotiations between the two dictatorships moved with remarkable speed. Old enemies found common ground in cold calculation. Ideology was set aside, replaced by maps, borders, and spheres of influence. The world did not yet know what was being prepared behind closed doors in Moscow. Newspapers continued to speculate, and diplomats continued to speak of peace, but the fate of Europe was already being decided. The fragile order created after World War I was collapsing, and a new, darker chapter was about to begin. The agreement that would soon be signed would not only redraw borders, it would shatter illusions, betray smaller nations, and ignite the most destructive conflict in human history. Europe was no longer merely on the brink of war. It was being pushed toward it by fear, ambition, and a pact born from distrust. The pact that shocked the world. In August 1939, diplomacy stopped pretending. The careful language of negotiations gave way to urgency, secrecy, and speed. Europe's capitals were filled with rumors, but few imagined that the most dramatic move would come not from London or Paris, but from Moscow. As armies prepared and borders hardened, two regimes that had spent years denouncing each other suddenly moved closer, driven not by trust but by calculation. For Adolf Hitler, time had become a critical factor. His military plans were ready, his generals confident, and his target Poland clearly chosen. Yet one obstacle remained unresolved. A war against Poland would almost certainly draw Britain and France into the conflict. If the Soviet Union also opposed Germany, the nightmare of a two-front war would become reality. Hitler needed a diplomatic solution, not peace, but permission to strike without interference from the East. Joseph Stalin was equally impatient. The Soviet leadership had watched European diplomacy collapse into confusion. Talks with Britain and France dragged on without clear commitments. Delegations arrived slowly, spoke cautiously, and lacked authority to make binding decisions. To Stalin, this hesitation confirmed his suspicion that the Western powers were unreliable and indecisive. Worse, he feared they might encourage Germany to attack eastward while staying out of the conflict themselves. Against this backdrop, secret German overtures to Moscow began to look attractive. What had once seemed unthinkable now appeared practical. German diplomats suggested a non-aggression agreement, promising respect for Soviet security and economic cooperation. The proposal was bold, but its clarity appealed to Stalin. Unlike the West, Germany was offering concrete guarantees, not vague promises. Negotiations accelerated rapidly. The pace itself was astonishing. Years of hostility were brushed aside in a matter of days. Ideological enemies spoke the language of interest and advantage. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop was dispatched to Moscow, carrying not only a draft treaty but also the authority to make sweeping concessions. On the Soviet side, Vyacheslav Molotov conducted talks with precision and firmness, fully backed by Stalin. On the night of August 23, 1939, the agreement was signed. Officially, it was a simple non-aggression pact. Germany and the Soviet Union pledged to refrain from violence against each other and promised neutrality if either became involved in war. On the surface, it appeared defensive and cautious. But beneath that surface lay the true heart of the deal. Attached to the treaty was a secret protocol, unknown to the world. In it, Eastern Europe was divided into spheres of influence. Borders were drawn not along cultural or national lines, but according to strategic convenience. Poland was marked for partition. The Baltic states were assigned to Soviet control. Other regions were quietly exchanged like bargaining chips. Entire nations were reduced to clauses in a hidden document. The implications were enormous. By signing the pact, Hitler secured his eastern flank and cleared the path for immediate military action. He no longer needed to fear Soviet intervention when German troops crossed into Poland. At the same time, Stalin gained territorial influence and strategic depth, pushing the Soviet frontier westward without firing a shot. News of the agreement spread rapidly and caused disbelief across the world. Communist parties, long committed to fighting fascism, were thrown into confusion. How could the Soviet Union align itself with Nazi Germany? Supporters struggled to explain the decision, while critics denounced it as betrayal. In democratic capitals, the reaction was equally severe. Britain and France realized too late that their diplomatic failures had driven Moscow into Berlin's arms. For smaller nations, the pact was a death sentence. Poland understood that it now faced two powerful enemies instead of one. The Baltic states sensed that their independence was hanging by a thread. There was no longer any illusion of collective security. International law, already weakened, had been openly discarded. Economic cooperation soon followed. The Soviet Union agreed to supply Germany with vital raw materials: oil, grain, metals that would help sustain its war effort. In return, Germany offered industrial goods and military technology. This exchange strengthened both sides in the short term, even as it prepared the ground for future conflict. Less than 2 weeks after the pact was signed, its purpose became brutally clear. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland from the west. The attack was swift and overwhelming, driven by modern tactics and superior firepower. Britain and France declared war on Germany, marking the official beginning of World War II. Yet in the east, the Soviet Union remained silent. That silence ended on September 17. Soviet troops crossed into eastern Poland, claiming to protect local populations. In reality, they were enforcing the secret agreement. Poland was crushed between two invading armies, its government forced into exile, its territory erased from the map once again. The Nazi-Soviet pact had achieved its immediate goal. War had begun on Germany's terms, and the balance of power in Eastern Europe had been violently transformed. But beneath the surface of cooperation, mistrust remained. Neither side believed the arrangement would last forever. Each was already preparing for the moment when the pact would become useless. What the world had just witnessed was not an alliance built on shared values, but a temporary convergence of interests between two ruthless regimes. The pact shocked because it revealed an uncomfortable truth about international politics: when fear and ambition collide, even the deepest hatreds can be suspended. The agreement signed in Moscow did more than start a war. It destroyed the last illusions of moral restraint in European diplomacy. From that moment on, the conflict would no longer be about negotiation or compromise. It would be about survival, domination, and the relentless use of power. An unnatural partnership. Once the borders were redrawn and the guns fell silent in occupied Poland, Europe entered a strange and unsettling phase. War had officially begun, yet much of the continent experienced a deceptive calm. Behind this quiet surface, however, two totalitarian powers were reshaping Eastern Europe through force, fear, and administration. The agreement signed in Moscow had moved from paper to practice, and its consequences were now being felt by millions who had never been consulted. In the territories seized by Germany, a ruthless system of control was established almost immediately. Civil administration was replaced by military authority, and repression became policy rather than exception. Schools were closed, cultural institutions dismantled, and political leaders arrested. The goal was not simply occupation, but transformation. German planners viewed these lands as future extensions of the Reich, to be stripped of resistance and reshaped according to Nazi ideology. Violence was systematic, organized, and justified through bureaucratic language. East of the newly drawn line, Soviet forces imposed their own version of order. Local administrations were dissolved, property seized, and political organizations banned. Thousands were arrested under accusations of disloyalty or counter-revolutionary activity. Families were separated, transported deep into the Soviet interior, and resettled in harsh conditions. The methods differed from those of the Nazis, but the result was similar: the destruction of independent social and political life. Despite their parallel actions, Berlin and Moscow maintained formal cooperation. Military delegations exchanged visits, border commissions met to resolve disputes, and intelligence services shared limited information. Trains carrying goods crossed borders regularly. Raw materials flowed westward, while machinery and industrial products moved east. This exchange strengthened both war economies and created the illusion of stability. Yet beneath this cooperation lay deep suspicion. Neither regime trusted the other, and both prepared for betrayal. German military planners studied Soviet territory with growing interest, while Soviet intelligence monitored German troop movements with increasing concern. Publicly, the pact was praised as a triumph of realism. Privately, it was treated as a temporary arrangement. The wider war began to expand rapidly. In Western Europe, Germany launched a series of bold offensives that stunned the world. One country after another collapsed under the pressure of speed, coordination, and modern warfare. The fall of France marked a turning point, elevating Germany to the position of dominant power on the continent. From Moscow, these victories were watched with mixed emotions: admiration for German efficiency, but also fear of what such power might eventually be turned against. As Germany's influence grew, the balance within the partnership shifted. Economic demands increased, and Soviet shipments became more urgent to German planners. Oil, grain, and metals were no longer trade items, they were lifelines. The Soviet leadership fulfilled these obligations, calculating that continued cooperation would delay confrontation. Every month gained was considered valuable. At the same time, the Soviet Union moved decisively to consolidate its expanded influence. Political systems were reorganized, borders reinforced, and local elites replaced with loyal administrators. Resistance was crushed quickly and quietly. The language of liberation was used, but the reality was control. The pact had not brought peace to Eastern Europe, it had replaced one set of threats with another. For ordinary people living under occupation, the future became uncertain and dangerous. Loyalty was constantly questioned, identities were suppressed, and survival depended on adaptation. Families disappeared overnight, rumors spread faster than facts, and fear became a daily companion. The great decisions made by distant leaders translated into hunger, displacement, and silence at home. Internationally, the agreement continued to undermine trust. Governments in exile struggled to gain recognition. Smaller states realized that neutrality offered no protection. The moral authority of international institutions collapsed further as the war spread. The world was learning, painfully, that agreements between powerful states could erase borders without warning. As 1940 turned into 1941, signs of strain became more visible. German officials complained about delivery delays. Soviet leaders questioned German intentions in newly conquered territories. Diplomatic language grew colder, more formal. The smiles at official meetings masked growing anxiety. Inside Germany, strategic discussions increasingly focused eastward. Military planners argued that continued cooperation with the Soviet Union carried risks. Resources were useful, but dependence was dangerous. Ideology also reasserted itself. The idea that Germany could tolerate a powerful communist state on its border began to seem unacceptable to the Nazi leadership. In Moscow, reports from intelligence sources painted a troubling picture. Troop concentrations, infrastructure projects, and logistical preparations suggested that Germany might be preparing for something far larger than defense. These warnings were debated, analyzed, and often dismissed. The fear of provoking conflict led to caution, even denial. The partnership, never based on trust, was now sustained only by habit and fear. Each side believed that the other would act first, and each hoped to delay that moment as long as possible. Cooperation continued, but it had become mechanical, hollow, and tense. What had begun as a shocking diplomatic maneuver was turning into a dangerous illusion. The pact had rearranged borders and altered the course of the war, but it could not reconcile two systems built on domination and expansion. The forces holding the agreement together were weakening, and both sides sensed it. By the spring of 1941, the unnatural partnership stood at a crossroads. Publicly, relations remained correct. Privately, preparations accelerated. The future of Europe was once again being decided not through treaties, but through plans, maps, and armies waiting for orders. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the pause before something far greater and far more destructive. When the agreement collapsed. Before dawn on June 22, 1941, the stillness across Eastern Europe broke apart. Without warning, columns of German troops surged forward, aircraft roared overhead, and artillery fire tore through the borderlands. The scale of the assault was unlike anything seen before. The agreement that had once promised neutrality and restraint dissolved in a single morning. What followed was not merely a military operation, but a turning point that reshaped the war and the century that followed. The invasion revealed the true nature of the earlier arrangement. The pact had never been built on confidence or shared purpose, it had been a pause, a strategic delay disguised as cooperation. Now that delay was over. German forces advanced rapidly, overwhelming defensive positions and capturing vast territories. Entire regions fell within weeks. Cities burned, civilians fled, and the front line moved so quickly that maps became outdated almost as soon as they were printed. For the Soviet Union, the shock was devastating. Command structures failed, communication collapsed, and millions of soldiers were caught unprepared. Retreats turned chaotic, and losses mounted at a staggering rate. Yet the initial disaster did not lead to collapse. Instead, the invasion triggered a massive mobilization. Factories were dismantled and moved east, populations were evacuated, and the entire society was reorganized around survival. As the conflict intensified, it became clear that this was a different kind of war. It was not limited to territory or resources. It was ideological, racial, and absolute. The invading forces pursued policies of destruction that targeted not only armies but entire populations. Villages were erased, food supplies seized, and civilians treated as obstacles rather than human beings. The consequences were catastrophic. Gradually, the momentum shifted. The vast distances, harsh climate, and determined resistance slowed the advance. What had been planned as a swift victory turned into a prolonged struggle. Losses on both sides reached unimaginable levels. The battlefield expanded into cities, forests, and frozen plains. Survival became the primary objective, replacing earlier calculations of advantage. Internationally, the collapse of the agreement transformed the structure of the war. The Soviet Union aligned itself with other powers resisting German expansion. Resources, intelligence, and coordination flowed across continents. The conflict became truly global, binding together states with little in common except the need to defeat a shared enemy. The earlier diplomatic maneuvering faded in importance as the scale of violence consumed all attention. The agreement that had once shocked the world now appeared as a prelude to greater tragedy. Its consequences extended far beyond its brief existence. By enabling early expansion and delaying confrontation, it altered the timing, geography, and human cost of the war. Entire regions bore scars that would last for generations. Borders shifted again, but memories did not. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the reckoning began. Documents emerged, testimonies were collected, and responsibility was debated. The hidden arrangements that had once determined the fate of nations were exposed to public scrutiny. The idea that power alone could guarantee security was challenged by the sheer scale of destruction it had unleashed. In the years that followed, the world attempted to rebuild. New institutions were created, alliances formed, and principles declared. Yet the shadow of earlier decisions remained. For many in Eastern Europe, the war did not end cleanly, it transformed into a different form of control and division. Liberation and domination often arrived together, leaving complex legacies that resisted simple judgment. Historically, the pact occupies an uncomfortable place. It cannot be explained solely as betrayal, nor fully justified as necessity. It was a product of fear, ambition, and mistrust operating within a broken international system. The agreement revealed how fragile moral boundaries become when survival is perceived to be at stake. For the leaders who signed it, the pact achieved limited goals and produced irreversible consequences. It delayed confrontation for one side and enabled expansion for the other. But it also set in motion events that neither could fully control. The costs were paid not by those at negotiating tables, but by civilians, soldiers, and societies forced to endure its aftermath. Today, the story of that agreement serves as a warning rather than a lesson neatly learned. It demonstrates how diplomacy divorced from accountability can accelerate catastrophe. It shows how secrecy can undermine stability, and how short-term advantage can produce long-term disaster. The collapse of the pact did not simply mark the beginning of a new phase of war. It exposed the illusion at the heart of power politics, the belief that violence can be carefully managed, that enemies can be paused rather than confronted, and that human consequences can be postponed indefinitely. In the end, the agreement failed because it was never meant to last. It was a transaction, not a resolution. Its legacy lies not in what it promised, but in what it made possible. The war that followed would redraw maps, destroy empires, and redefine global power. But long after the battles ended, the memory of that pact remained, reminding the world that some decisions echo far beyond their moment. History records treaties and dates, but it remembers consequences more clearly. The pact was one such decision, quietly signed, briefly effective, and permanently consequential.